All right, this is the follow up, and we are following up on a live video I did a couple months ago where I was talking about my preparation for the show Spring Awakening. My guest today at the follow up is none other but the great Duncan Sheik, the composer of Spring Awakening. Duncan, thanks so much for making yourself available and welcome to the follow up.
Thanks, George.
Awesome.
It's nice to see you. It's
Same
been a
here.
minute.
Yeah, same here. Absolutely. It's been a minute, exactly. Um, so for those who have been listening in and watching these videos, let me just give you a little bit of background. Spring Awakening was a show, was my first Broadway chair, and Duncan was the composer of this show, of that show, I should say. Um, and what I tried to explain in the live video was sort of my preparation of going into this, which was influenced by the directives. It, there being the need for it to sound like a garage band, there being string arrangements by Simon Hale, and there also being this mixture of sort of electronica and very analog elements, meaning acoustic guitars, drums, djembe, acoustic bass, cello, all of that. And now, what I'm trying to do with these follow up videos is to give a different perspective on stuff that I already talked about. So, Duncan was kind enough to make himself available. And, Duncan, my question to you, of course, is what went, and I totally understand if you can't go into too much detail because there's a lot that goes into it, but what went into the creation of the music of Spring Awakening?
Well, so yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting that they said garage band and then string arrangements and kind of electronic and acoustic things. I mean, I think that everything but the first designation makes a lot of sense.
Right.
I mean, I guess garage band, unfortunately, I sort of think of entry level Apple software, as
Of
opposed to
course.
the way in which it was meant for you, probably, which is like teenagers, playing guitars, bass, drums, sort of very haphazardly in their house in some fashion, which I did a lot of,
Hmm.
as a 11, 12, 13-year old, for sure.
Right.
But I like to think that the touchstone for Spring Awakening was more kind of like arty alternative rock
Okay.
than a garage band. I mean, there wasn't I don't think there was any aspect of it that was trying to be purposefully um, kind of purposefully like underplayed
Right.
or naively played. It wasn't there wasn't any calculus like that.
Right.
Um, uh, I guess so. Maybe I should go back. Well, okay, we can talk about. So there is an alternative rock aspect to it for sure,
Right.
and I think that's the thing that audiences kind of attached to initially because of things like The Bitch of Living and Totally Fucked, and you did have these kind of set pieces that were guitar driven and they were distorted guitars, and really there was those songs in some way were very authentically alternative rock songs, which
Right.
was novel on Broadway at the time. I mean,
That was totally.
certainly there had been things which I'm sorry I have to call sort of airsats rock music on Broadway before that. Um,
For those who don't know, ersatz is German for substitute. Okay, let's just let's just put that out there.
but but I mean, for not to take anything away from the brilliance of a lot of composers who dressed up their music in rock clothing, uh,
Right.
most of these shows that were thought of as like sort of like rock on Broadway, they were mainly sort of coming from a very a specific musical theater tradition compositionally,
Yeah.
and then they might have guitars and synthesizers in there, in
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
to
God
jazz it
forbid.
up.
Yeah.
But
That's-
it, but it really, to anyone who kind of grew up more specifically with authentic rock music, it never had quite the right sound.
right.
And so, my I guess where naivete does come into it, um, is that Stephen Sater, the co-writer, the lyricist and book writer of the show, he and I had never written a musical before,
Mm.
and we didn't really have a. In some ways, we didn't have too much attachment to that tradition. I mean,
Right.
we were certainly fans of great shows within the music, the canon of musical theater. But it wasn't like we had an encyclopedic knowledge, and we didn't go to school
Yeah.
to studying musical theater the way a lot of composers have. And it wasn't, certainly wasn't the bread and butter of my experience listening to records growing up.
Right.
So in a way, my naive assertion was like, well, what if you just said, forget about what musical theater music is supposed to sound like, and you just made it sound like any cool band that was on any teenager's iPod
Yeah.
in the year 2005, or of course it was written, let's say it was written between 1999 and 2007.
Right.
So over the course of those 7 years, so that was the kind of the initial idea. And and because of what I was listening to at the time, which were things, like Jeff Buckley and Bjork and
Yeah.
Radiohead,
Yeah.
and some more sort of obscure English kind of arty rock bands, the Doves and things like that. Those were the things that were my influences. So that really was a combination of sort of alternative rock, and then uh, certainly this kind of hybridization of electronic music kind of coming into things.
Right.
As you saw with Radiohead and Kid A and OK Computer,
Yeah.
you saw rock bands starting to use Juno 60s and certain drum machines of a certain vintage kind of coming back into vogue.
Yeah.
And so I was definitely interested in all of that, because I had been playing those instruments in the mid 80s when they came out,
Right.
as a teenager. So it was kind of fun to rediscover those sounds again. And then there are sort of two other big influences in the show. One of which obviously is just really folk music. I mean, if you
Mm.
think about the very beginning of Spring Awakening, it starts with like the most sort of ultimately folky piece of music you can imagine in a
Yeah.
musical.
Yeah.
And that just comes from my fascination with Nick Drake and John Martin, and then on the American side or Canadian side, Gordon Lightfoot, or
Mm.
or people like Jim Croce even, or Harry Chapin, whatever. These are like kind of really great acoustic guitar based songwriters. And then there was a sort of a fourth element that was at work that is probably, it's much more subtle, and it just has to more do with the kind of harmonic landscape of the chord progressions than the form, which is sort of 20th century classical music, things like Arvo Pärt and John Adams
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Steve Reich, and these kinds of things were definitely in my in my listening rotation, and
Right.
they were sort of influencing a lot of what was going into that music. Um, so yeah, so I
Out
think
of yeah, out of all of those influences, you were able to sort of come up with these songs that very much had an authenticity onto themselves. I mean, that's kind of I thought that was a big takeaway from it, and from what you're saying right now, like all of these influences, through the filter of well, I've not never really done this before, but you know, what if we actually put something out that sounds, that reminisces, or that is influenced by this music that I like, and that is constantly in my ear.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. I mean, that is pretty deep, and that's a good understanding of it. One thing that I've totally forgot to mention, and that was when I got that directive of GarageBand. What that meant, after hearing the music for the first time, what that meant to me was Husker Du.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think of Husker Du, they have a kind of a unique place in alternative rock
yeah,
history, for a few reasons, but they sort of really straddle like post-punk and new wave and alternative
exactly.
rock and you
Exactly.
know
There was
pop.
that very energetic element to it, that
Yeah,
again made its way into Totally Fucked and Bitch of Living, and all of that, with very high end, very high energy, sort of, I don't want to say frantic, but furious, right?
yeah, sure.
And that definitely, I don't know, that just rang a bell for me, so to speak.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, those were records that were part of my catalog as a teenager. Although maybe more, it's interesting as when I was when I was like, let's say 15, 16, 17, the things that I was listening to there weren't a lot of guitar bands there. I mean, there was the Smiths, there
Oh
was
wow.
the Cure,
Mm.
but other than that, it was a lot of stuff like um,
Depeche Mode.
Depeche Mode and New Order and Psychedelic Furs, which had become kind of a keyboardy band, and
Right.
Talk Talk, were really a keyboard band that sort of ultimately morphed into a very organic,
Right.
real instrument band. But Japan, for example, like
Ooh.
Tin Drum, that record was just all Prophet Five and Drum Machine,
Mm.
and so as a teenager, I was listening to all these really synth oriented bands. And then in my sort of late teens and early 20s, I kind of went through I kind of shifted into this much more organic sound palette.
Mm.
And I was a guitar player first and foremost. So that was, I don't want to say easy, but it was natural for me.
Mm.
And so that's really reflected in my own first records where, there are some synths here or there on the first two records, but it's mostly guitars
Right.
and drums and basses and string arrangements.
Right.
And and so it was around the time when I was writing the Spring Awakening stuff that in fact there was a lot more, like in the demos there was a lot more synth bass than there
Mm.
was like actual bass, if I remember
How
correctly.
dare you?
Yeah. But we didn't make you bust out the mini moog or anything in the show.
I would have,
I know.
like that.
I know.
That is one thing I really enjoy doing, actually.
Yeah. As well you should.
Yeah, 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 most definitely. No, but but the one thing that you did do was that, and I remember this very well in the first rehearsal, or first time I actually met you, which was at Baruch College, right, for the workshop, and we're rehearsing this, and in walks Duncan, and sits down and starts playing the songs with the guitar, and stops and says, "Okay, I'm making an executive decision. We're gonna have upright bass in this." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." All of a sudden you had like this additional texture, you had additional sound, and that definitely enriched the entire process and the entire product, I should say. It was noticeable um, how open there was, or I should say, like how much of an openness there was towards sound and towards stuff that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily hear in this context.
Sure. I mean, part of the reason that um, I mean, the person that suggested you to me was our mutual friend Jeff Allen,
Yes.
and and Jeff suggested you in part because he knew you were both amazing upright player and you know electric bass player. And so
Thank you.
certainly that decision to have upright was it wasn't just made on the spot at Brut, but
Oh,
I might have just said in that particular song, oh yeah, let's have upright bass.
what? There's like some. I'm getting some background now. This is
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, no, I definitely was going to want upright bass. And also because we only had violin,
Right,
like two violins, or violin, viola, cello, I should
right.
say. Because we only had the trio there, it seemed like, well, at least if you had a bowed bass, it sort of is like a fake string quartet in a way for
Yeah,
certain things.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Yeah. There
and
was.
yeah, and yeah, so anyway, I mean, and Jeff is also a really good, but is
Upright
very,
player.
very
Yeah.
good at both styles of
Oh
bass.
yeah.
But we Jeff and I had a disagreement about how one behaves in hotel rooms. So you got the call for.
Damn. This is juicy. What the hell?
No, Jeff is a really great guy. I'm just teasing him.
I
You should.
know, I know. He's actually on the live video this week.
Oh,
I'm
good.
doing a live video dedicated to him this week because he kind of spurred the whole idea of textures in bass playing, and he, we had long conversations way before we met. You and I met.
Yeah,
Um, I had known Jeff from living uptown, and we had these long conversations about texture and whatnot. So he's gonna be the guest on the live video this week on Friday.
yeah.
Listen, very quickly, the last sort of question that I have for you is, and I always made that connection somehow in my mind. It made sense, and I was wondering whether that resonates with you. Um, the timing of White Limousine and Spring Awakening,
Mm.
how far or how much was there sort of a cross pollination between those two endeavors? I mean, this is, one is an album, and one is a musical theater show. Fully understanding that there is, like, obviously differences in those two endeavors. Nevertheless, I'm wondering, and I'm not a songwriter, but
Mm.
for you as a songwriter, is there sort of a cross pollination going on where one thing influences the other and then
Yeah.
it goes back and forth?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, in point of fact, the music for Spring Awakening was written over the course of the writing and recording of three other records, which
Oh
is
wow.
Phantom Moon. That
Mm,
was my third record that was on Nonesuch that Stephen wrote the lyrics to.
right.
Um, and then Daylight was sort of my last, pop record for Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And that came out in 2002. So you know, a lot of I would say the lion's share of the Spring Awakening songs were written around those two records, in fact.
Oh, okay.
And then White Limousine, came out sort of at a similar time to Spring Awakening, and but that was, by the time I was writing that record, most of the Spring Awakening songs had been written, with a couple of exceptions.
Got it.
So yeah, there was certainly overlap with all of them. The essential difference being just the essential difference in the medium or the genre,
Right.
is that in the case of Spring Awakening, uh, I I was writing songs to kind of fit the emotional moment of a point within a larger narrative, and telling a story that wasn't my own.
Mm.
It's a piece of expressionist theater that tells this sort of it's a great story, but it's more of a kind of
It's a very
it's more
universal.
of it's a rebuke towards sort of bourgeois,
Right.
German, mores,
Mm.
um, and attitudes, and so I'm sort of trying to write music that has that sort of spirit of adolescent rebellion, for lack of a better word.
Right.
Um, uh, but these are all different adolescents with sort of different energies about them, so Ernst and Hanschen have, their sort of romantic and,
Mm-hmm.
but sort of lopsided energy, and Moritz has his sort of yearning energy, and Melchior has his kind of, seeking mind energy, and
Right.
Vendela has her kind of, her, you know, I hate to say it, but kind of teenage girl, heartbroken energy.
Right. 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 Right.
So you're kind of writing to character,
Right. Right.
whereas in the case of White Limousine, I was sort of writing that record. I was writing really a kind of a that was my rebuke to sort of the Bush administration.
Mm.
But what halcyon days those were.
Oh yeah, this long gone now. This
I was really, I really
we,
sort of shot my load in that case. But
we
anyway,
thought that was bad, but
yeah, right,
yeah,
right. And it was bad. I mean,
yeah,
that's the problem, is that people forget that
it was
you
really
know,
bad.
it,
Yeah,
it was bad. I mean, George Bush is arguably more a nicer, saner human being, but he did cause these wars that
oh yeah,
caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, and that's a problem.
yeah.
Anyway, we digress. Um,
It's
uh,
okay.
but yeah, I mean, again, like Daylight. A lot of these songs were sort of written around the same time as Daylight, in fact, and
Mm,
um, yeah, so I there, of course, there's sort of a cross pollination there,
right.
um, but they also have the, except for Phantom Moon, which was Stephen's lyrics. Daylight and White Limousine are, my lyrics, which
Mm,
are obviously hugely different in their sort of affect,
right.
and content, and every which way. So it's kind of two different mindsets.
Right.
But I like to think that there is somewhat of an aesthetic, um, uh, closet that they belong in.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, because that I mean that was at the time I wasn't necessarily all that familiar with your oeuvre,
Yeah,
but I definitely yeah I did notice a shared aesthetic, so to speak.
yeah,
And then of course later as the years progressed and I got into Phantom Moon and Daylight and all of that, and then I was like, okay, well, this sounds like Duncan, just
yeah,
like Spring Awakening sounds like Duncan. There's just
yeah,
no two ways about that. That was no, that was totally totally noticeable, and perhaps again, like my 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 naivety on this, what that is concerned, as a interpreted the directives, in on the one hand in the energy of Husker and on the other hand the sort of sculpted, modeled aesthetic of White Limousine, right?
yeah,
So and then of course there was like a bunch of electronica in there as well, which I didn't necessarily put into the 80s uh, part, so to speak, or in the
yeah,
80s period, but more like into the late 90s, early 2000s period. As a definitely more influence after I moved to New York.
yeah,
Um, so I definitely also saw sort of the introduction of the upright bass, especially the bowed upright bass, as a tip of the hat towards electronica. Because all of a
yeah,
sudden you didn't have bass lines that involved a lot of notes or anything, but more sort of a frequency
yeah.
that created a texture and therefore a mood and a basis for everything else that went on top of it, right? So
Yeah, I mean that's I mean interestingly, that's the thing about an upright bass, is that you have the ability to play it with fingers where it's one thing, and play it with
right,
a bow where it's sort of more, it in some ways it is more like a mini moog,
right,
where you've got the sort of the cutoff frequency fairly high, and you've got all that sort of buzzing happening, and you've
yeah,
got sort of held tone.
right,
So you could definitely make a connection between those things. But also, I think if you look at an artist like Bjork, who
Yeah.
was around that time sort of marrying orchestration, choral things and orchestrated things with really interesting programming
Oh yeah.
and electronic music, like, that was also a sort of a piece of what was happening in
Right.
terms of my influences. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. There was a band, Prefuse 72 or Prefuse 73. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but I think they're
Rings a
New York.
bell.
Yeah, they're New York based, and they have like this very strong electronica element, together with samplers, together with a variety of sequences and whatnot, and yet they also kept part of this analog element in terms of, and with them it becomes super straight ahead electric guitars, like no
Okay.
effects, right?
Yeah,
Just electric guitar into an amp, perhaps a little bit of reverb, but that's it, right?
that's it. Yeah.
So you have on the one hand that element, and then you have all these sequences, sounds, samples, turned around speeches and all of that stuff. So that,
Yeah.
again, in my naivety, I was like, okay, well, this is, I can go into the Prefuse 73, influenced part of my brain, and
Mm.
be like, okay, this, I can find a space there, right? I
Yeah.
can find a place for the bass to sit, and I know exactly what I need to do. So that's, but that was, again, this is not about my perspective, like it's
No,
about
no,
your
yeah.
perspective.
I mean, it's interesting how, the more, like, I sort of stumbled upon that thing of just using a really um a sort of as just sort of a sine wave or a square wave with sort of almost no high frequencies whatsoever. I
Right.
stumbled upon using that in my music pretty early on, and
Mm,
which sort of in a way kind of comes from hip hop almost, you could argue, but it's just this thing of this just all low end that's got almost no frequencies above, let's say, 300.
right.
And that, whether it's coming from a Juno or from a Moog or whatever, Moog, I should say, that's become a really sort of important part of how I compose, because a lot of times it's just like, okay, I'll just have that there because I'll know what the bass is, and it's just like not getting in the way of anything.
Right.
And then I can kind of go in and mess around with it and see, well, does it need to be, more just like like I kind of have three main basses that I record with.
Mm.
Is that okay for me to get into this?
Yeah, yeah, please, of course. I'm like, my ears are burning. This is
Okay.
awesome.
So, I mean, the most sort of straight ahead one is just this sort of Gibson SG bass that I have that I think you've probably
Oh
seen.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's pretty straight ahead, and it records really well. Sort of doesn't sound like much coming out of the speakers by itself, and then inside a mix is just like, whoa, it's really juicy.
Right.
And then I have a single pickup Silvertone,
Mm.
that just has its sort of single pickup in the neck position,
Right.
and it has just a volume and a tone knob, and it's just amazing. It's
Yeah.
just an amazing instrument because you can turn the tone up and get some grind, or turn it off and not have it, but
Yeah.
it just has this kind of fantastic sound. And then I found this really weird kind of Ibanez
Mm.
acoustic guitar bass.
Oh
It's not
wow.
like, not even like full scale. And I bought it for like $200
Mm.
on Sunset Boulevard at Sam Ash.
Mm.
And it just has this sort of normal piezo pickup thing, but it's really loud. It's like really loud. So the
Mm.
signal to noise ratio is fantastic. And it ends up just sounding like a square wave. It's really
Mm.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
but
yeah.
you get all that sort of character when you're playing it up on the neck. So I end up using that a lot if I don't want to just be using like a synth, regular synth bass.
Yeah.
Um, so and then finally, I have a pretty cool jazz bass. I don't have a P bass, but I end up not really recording with it that much. So maybe I'll get back into a phase where I'm
You
recording.
know, it's I mean, it's a funny thing because as I said, like the whole single pickup instrument has a very distinct sound, a very distinct aura, so to speak. I cannot. I mean, this is might not be the right word for it, but there is something about the immediacy and that, and I of course I play upright and electric, so I always liken it to playing the upright. With the upright you have an immediacy of sound production, right,
Yeah,
that you just don't have with the electric bass. With the electric bass you have the solid state, a solid instrument going through
yeah,
a cable into a speaker, and sure, if you see the amplifier as an extension of that instrument, then yes, then you have immediacy. But as the instrument by itself does not give you immediate feedback,
yeah,
right? The
totally.
upright bass totally does have that, right?
Yeah,
Now, the one place where the electric bass, at least for me and for my aesthetic, for my ear, where all of a sudden that immediacy becomes very small and concise, so to speak, is with a single pickup instrument. And it's
right.
not with an instrument with two pickups for whatever reason, right?
Yeah,
But with a single pickup instrument, you have that, for lack of better description, almost acoustic uh, um,
yeah.
sound production, right?
Yeah, well, I honestly, what I think that that is you have, a single source of sound going into one
Yeah,
source of like, I think of this lipstick pickup on the Silvertone bass, but it's one sound going into one place, going through one wire, going into one speaker. Like it's very much like just a hardwired thing. Whereas with a jazz bass or a P bass or whatever, if you're using both pickups, it's diffuse in a way, like
right,
it's
right,
diffuse over the whole instrument,
right,
which is
right.
giving it this amazing, beautiful sound in its own right. But it's not that like direct hot wire out of the speaker, so to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's the singularity of the energy going through
Yeah,
whatever it is going through. It's just not there anymore.
yeah,
Now you can, of course, you can see the two pickups in the relation of the two pickups to each other. You
yes,
can see that as a singularity, right?
yes,
And then
yeah,
all of a sudden you have people who can really sculpt that.
yeah,
Think of any of the great any of the great musicians, who played that instrument, be it a jazz bass or be it anything that derives from the jazz bass.
yeah.
So, and also I should tell this to the listeners, to the watchers out there. Duncan is a phenomenal bass player. and what you said just now with the sort of drone going on, and that that's there, that's the minute you said that, I was like, oh, wait a second, okay, that's why his bass lines sound the way they do. Because when you listen to your projects, where you're playing bass, you very often go away from the functional and you go into this other mode where all of a sudden there is a melodicism. I don't know whether I can call it counterpoint. I don't know whether that's behind that,
Okay. Yeah.
but there is a melodicism or a melodic content that's outside of how a bass player would think, right?
Totally. And I mean, for me, again, it's part naivete and part sort of hubris to just think, well, I can sort of play all this stuff and get away with it. So and also it's like being what it is. It's like being a not very accurate copyist of like
Mm,
random R&B songs that are in my brain somewhere,
mm,
and
mm.
just being like, oh, this is this pentatonic riff that I kind of remember from some record from Stevie Wonder or whatever it is. I don't know. And I'm just going to like kind of play some version of that. And
Yeah.
that's what, like on Whisper House, for example, that's where a lot of those bass lines
Oh yeah.
came from.
Oh yeah.
Um, and because I do love how the instrument sounds up the neck. And
Right.
sometimes I feel like it's something that people don't explore enough,
Right.
because there's a lot of really cool possibilities up there. But then, of course, it can get, it can get tiresome. You see, if it's if it's overused like anything else. So I don't know. It's I was playing a lot of bass yesterday because I was at my studio in Garrison,
Mm.
and I was kind of just going through an inventory of my stuff and inventory of pedals and stuff, and I ended up like playing a lot more bass than guitar. because
Mm.
I was just like, oh, what happens if I, what happens if I play bass through this pedal or that pedal or whatever? And there's something so interesting about, two notes on a bass playing a minor third or a major, I'm sorry, like a, an 11th or a 13th, I
Right,
should say, whatever.
right.
There's just something about that gives you so much information with so few elements.
Yeah.
And it's something really fantastic. It is its own sort of compression
Oh yeah.
of harmonic information in a great way.
Yeah.
Then at that point, you know what the chord is. You know what the
Yeah.
root is. You know if it's major or minor. What more do you really need? Let other people figure
Yeah,
out the rest
exactly. All
of that
those color notes or
really.
whatever, there's keyboards, guitar, who
Yeah,
needs it?
right.
But I mean that, bringing it back to Spring Awakening, because that you're saying something that kind of reminded me of the process of, especially recording, playing and recording the quote unquote string quartet parts, right? And that is, with the upright bass, you do have the possible danger of the instrument just taking up too much sonic space.
Yeah,
That was, and that is something that's a reality. That's just because of the huge body and whatnot. It has the possibility of just sonically taking up a lot of space on tape or on file or whatever you want to call it.
yeah,
Um, and I thought that the string arrangements that Simon came up and that we recorded at your studio
yeah,
were so brilliant, because they made us sound huge, right?
mm,
And they made us sound, um, everything was kind of in its own
spot.
space. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, spot, so to speak. And
yeah.
it was unlike anything that I had heard before. This
Yeah,
remarkable.
yeah. Well, Simon definitely. He's um, he's a master. I mean, there are not many people that I work with where, whatever I send his way and whatever he sends me back, I'm always just, I'm just instantly incredibly moved and psyched with what I get back from him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel very fortunate to have that relationship.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Most definitely. Now this it's noticeable at Spring Awakening, at Nightingale, at
Yeah.
Whisper
Yeah,
House.
and he's really been on all my records except the most recent one. So I need to remedy that. But
Mm.
once we get through this annus horribilis.
Oh yes. Yeah. This for those who don't know, that means horrible year. Okay. Anyway, listen, Duncan, I don't want to keep you too long. I know you have a busy day. I want to say thank you so much for making yourself available. This was awesome. This is, again, I'm trying to show different perspective on various topics that I talk about, and there's like a slew of topics. There's a slew of show preparation videos, and whatever. Basically, this whole George's Space Chat thing is just me giving back to the community, and also when I have a show, I get a lot of questions, because a lot of my shows, and this is where it ties in with Spring Awakening very well, a lot of my shows are original music shows, be it Spring Awakening, be it Memphis, be it Fun Home, to a certain degree you could even say Lady Day was nothing but original music. It was not music that was
Sure.
predominantly, that was already in existence,
Yeah.
although it's Lady Dave's jazz standards, basically.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, so
Well,
there
they
is
became standards. That initially they were just song.
exactly.
Songs
So yeah,
somebody
this
wrote.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. So, that I get a lot of questions about, okay, well, what's your process? How do you interpret certain things? And then I come up with my interpretation, or I show my perspective. And this was a great way to show your perspective as the composer, and kind of also, to be very clear, make a point of saying that this is done very deliberately. You know,
Mm.
this is not, there might be an element of leaving things up to chance, and there's an element of letting creativity just, you know, come in and come through. But there's also a good amount of, okay, well, how can I, these are my parameters, how can I interpret that as a songwriter, you know? So I want to say thank you so much for being here today, making yourself available, and you know, stay safe, stay sane.
Thank you.
Much love to the family, and
You too.
hopefully I'll see you soon, you know,
Yeah.
after this annus horribilis is
Yeah.
over.
In the real world. Yeah,
All right.
absolutely. Yeah.
All
All
right.
right. Thanks so much, George. Great to see you.
Take it easy. All right.